Ron Liebman and Tim Baker are former assistant U.S. attorneys who were part of the prosecution team that brought down Vice President Spiro Agnew on October the 10th, 1973. On that day, he appeared before the federal court in Baltimore and pleaded no contest to one felony charge, tax evasion for the year 1967. Messrs. Ron Liebman and Tim Baker, tell us about their role as the case unfolded. Agnew was fined $10,000 and placed on 3 years unsupervised probation. This conversation was originally recorded in 2019. Ron Liebman, when did you first meet Spiro Agnew?
Well, I never actually met Spiro Agnew. I've seen Spiro Agnew twice in my life. The first time was on October 10, 1973, sitting next to Tim Baker and Barney Skolnick in a federal court in Maryland when he entered to plead nolo contendere to a tax felony charge. The second time I saw him was a few days later. There's a restaurant in Baltimore called Sabatino's, and everybody ate there. And I was sitting there with my young bride at a table for two facing each other, and I looked up, and coming towards me from the back room, having had his own dinner, was Spiro Agnew and his wife and some security. And I was trying to get my wife's attention, and I was going, and she's saying, "What, are you all right?" And Agnew walked up to me, stopped, looked at me, and passed. And those are the only two times I've ever seen him.
Do you think he knew who you were?
Yeah, I think so. Our names, our pictures had been in the paper. And we were in court. He certainly stopped. Maybe he thought I was someone else.
Tim Baker, who was Spiro Agnew, and when did you first meet him?
The only time I was ever around him at all was the October 10th, 1973 in the courtroom in the federal courthouse in Baltimore. I was never anywhere near him. He had been, he was vice president, of course. Before that, he'd been governor of Maryland, and before that, he'd been the county executive of Baltimore County, which is how we happened upon him, because we were conducting a federal grand jury investigation of his successor, Dale Anderson, and with no idea whatsoever that it never entered our heads that we were going to encounter Agnew. But we did.
Let's come up to speed by seeing what he looked like and what he sounded like. He did a famous speech in Des Moines, Iowa, right after he became vice president on November the 13th. It was actually several months after that, but talking about the news media and the three networks in New York City. Let's watch Spiro Agnew.
The purpose of my remarks tonight is to focus your attention on this little group of men who not only enjoy a right of instant rebuttal to every presidential address, but more importantly, wield a free hand in selecting, presenting, and interpreting the great issues in our nation. The American people would rightly not tolerate this concentration of power in government. Is it not fair and relevant to question its concentration in the hands of a tiny, enclosed fraternity of privileged men elected by no one and enjoying a monopoly sanctioned and licensed by government? The views of a majority of this fraternity do not, and I repeat, not represent the views of America.
That was in 1969. When did you start to investigate him?
Well, we started our investigation, as Tim said, with a notion that what we would uncover and prosecute were bribery and extortionate activities involving zoning cases where a developer would pay off a county commissioner to change a residential area to a commercial area so he or she could build something. We started our investigation in the spring, I think it was.
January 1972.
And with, as Tim said, without any notion that this investigation, and indeed as quickly as it did, would get to Agnew, who was then Vice President of the United States.
What was your job then?
We were each assistant United States attorneys with the third guy, Barney Skolnick, was also an assistant, and our boss was the U.S. Attorney, George Bell.
Your job?
Same. Tim and I and Barney had known each other for a while. Tim and I were both law clerks for a federal judge, Tim for a Court of Appeals judge. I was a law clerk for a district court trial judge. We were in the same federal courthouse. Before I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office, Barney and Tim had a prosecutorial team that prosecuted a businessman and a county commissioner for bribery. And I was an associate in the law firm. I was working for a trial lawyer, and we defended one of those two defendants, the businessman. Then I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and soon thereafter, I joined Barney and Tim in this newly formed team, the objective of which was to look for corruption, principally in Baltimore County, Maryland.
How old were you two?
I was 30 in 1972, 31 the next year when Agnew resigned and entered his plea.
I was 29. I turned 30 on October 11, 1973, the day after Agnew entered his nolo contendere plea.
Barney was a year or two older than,
just a little bit.
and he had 2, 3, 4 years more prosecutive experience. When I first came to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the summer of 1971, I was immediately assigned to Barney, and we immediately began to prepare for trial. In the case that Ron was talking about, we tried the guy who was in effect the county executive for another Maryland county, Prince George's County.
In 2003, your boss at the time, who was 35 at the time, George Bell.
1970, not
My
2003.
2003 is when he gave this speech.
Right.
And he kind of summarized what you all went through. Let's watch. George Bell's deceased now. You can talk about him in a minute, but let's watch some of what he had to say in front of the Frostburg University, where he talked about this case.
As soon as Mr. Matz came in and told us his story, I was absolutely stunned, of course, because I, like everyone else, I think in the country, thought that the Vice President was the pillar of rectitude. He was a tall, imposing, handsome, well-spoken, strong individual who spoke not just eloquently but passionately about principles and morality and that sort of thing, and sounded very persuasive. And I was absolutely flabbergasted when Mr. Matz told us that there was another side to the Vice President.
George Bell, how did you all interact?
As Tim mentioned a moment ago, George Bell was the consummate United States attorney. He was hands down the best boss I ever had. He was a gentleman, he was smart, he took his job very seriously. He was from a very prominent Republican family. His father had been a senator. His brother at the time was a senator from Maryland. He was terrific, just terrific, all the way through.
What I would say about George is, of his many remarkable qualities, was a complete lack of vanity. He had pride, deservedly had pride, but no vanity. And frankly, he was dealing with 3 assistants who had very high opinions of themselves and very high opinions of their opinions, and were very forceful in articulating them. And George was never bothered about that. He was perfectly fine to let us have our say, and often went with what we thought we ought to be doing. And as Ron said, he was an excellent U.S. attorney, almost a paradigm example of how a U.S. attorney ought to handle himself.
Lester Matz, he talked about. Who was he? What impact did he have on this whole case?
Well, Lester Matz was a consulting engineer who had a firm that did a lot of public work. And in Maryland at the time, there was a system of graft. If you were qualified and you could do good work and you wanted your fair share of the work, you had to pay for it. And Lester Matz was one of the people who paid Spiro Agnew directly. As I recall it, someone had explained to Agnew, and we of course heard this third hand, early on in his political career, that you should have a bagman. You shouldn't take directly. Don't take money, illicit money, directly from anyone who wants to do business with a government entity. Have a bagman. That way you can insulate yourself and you have deniability. And indeed, Spiro Agnew had a bagman. In fact, he had two bagmen. But he was also, he was careless. If someone approached him with enough money to take directly, he took directly too. And Lester Matz was one of those.
Let's go back to George Bell, more from his speech talking about this situation.
Mr. Matz was the one who said that beginning in 1962, he had been paying Mr. Agnew on a regular basis from the time Mr. Agnew was the Baltimore County executive right through the time he was governor, and conclusively right up until January of 1969, when he visited the Vice President in the White House, in the Vice President's office. And he said he handed the Vice President a white envelope with $10,000 in cash in it, and said, you know, this is money I owe you from contracts that you gave us while you were governor of Maryland. I had our bookkeeper run the accounts, and you know, I'm now fully paid up, and I hope that going forward we'll have more federal work. And the Vice President, you know, slid back, pulled out the drawer in his desk, and accepted the envelope, put it in his desk, and they talked about, you know, sports.
Tim Baker, how did you work on this project together, the group of you?
Well, we all had somewhat different responsibilities. Barney was the leader of the team, by far the most experienced prosecutor, and I would have to say also the best. I think he was one of the very best in the country. So he was the leader. I was sort of the chief of staff. I was the guy who kept everything organized, the IRS agents, the grand jury, the witnesses, and also played a role as in a way, sort of the general counsel for the team. And Ron had defense lawyer experience, and so we counted on him to constantly look at the evidence we were gathering from potential defendants' point of view, and keep us alert to the minefield that we would be working in.
Where was your office physically located, and when was the first crack in this case?
We were, the U.S. Attorney's Office was located in the federal courthouse in Baltimore. The old federal courthouse is a more recent one in existence now. And I remember exactly, precisely when I first heard anything about Agnew being involved. And really, it involves Tim Baker. I was in Barney Skolnick's office. Tim had been on the phone in his own office, I guess, with, I think it was Lester Matz's lawyer. Lester Matz's lawyer was a very able, very decent fellow, very able lawyer, and he had known for some time that through his client, through a privileged communication, that his client had bribed the Vice President of the United States. And I think it was eating this lawyer alive. Tim had a conversation with this lawyer, and Tim, I may not have this exactly precisely correct, but this lawyer said something to Tim along the lines of, you know, you don't even want to know, you wouldn't want to know what there is out there. Something that my very smart colleague and friend quickly determined was a reference to Agnew. And I remember Tim coming into Barney's office, telling us about that call, and Barney and I exchanging looks saying, nah, that's too wild. Tim was absolutely right.
Tim, before you expound more on that, what was the atmosphere in the country at that time in Washington, D.C., when all this was going on?
Well, Watergate was front page news in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other newspapers around every day. And the circle was tightening around President Nixon. It still had a long way to go, but the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, his team was rigorously investigating the Watergate matter. And there was a great deal of tension in Washington around, was Nixon going to end up being impeached? Was he guilty of the cover-up? At least in the spring of 1972, that kind of that hadn't even started in the spring, because Watergate doesn't start until July of '72. Right. I'm thinking ahead to 73. So
Okay, he resigned on October the 10th, 1973. So what was the date that you first found out, and what was your reaction?
that was in May of 1973 when the defense lawyer for Matz says to me, we're trying to get Matz to cooperate against Dale Anderson, who he did pay off Anderson.
Anderson was the
was
executive.
Agnew's successor as county executive in Baltimore County. And the lawyer says to me, well, how much do you want to know? Are you really willing to do anything with what else Lester Matz can tell you? And I said, yes, we can. We are very interested in it. And then I went in and told Barney and Ron that we knew what it had to be. In fact, I think we were already very suspicious of Agnew ever since Agnew tried to get Kleindienst to shut the investigation down in January. At least I was.
Who was Kleindienst?
He was the Attorney General before Elliot Richardson, and we began our investigation in January 1972, and at the time Agnew was on a highly publicized tour of the Far East. But as soon as he came back to Washington, Matz and others went running to him saying, you've got to stop this investigation. And Agnew immediately went paid a personal visit to Kleindienst at the Department of Justice and said he had to stop this investigation. It was a political witch hunt. He complained bitterly about it. And Kleindienst called George Bell and said, George, what's going on here? And George was surprised because we weren't investigating Agnew. We were investigating a Democrat who was the county executive in Baltimore County.
So, okay, the team, the three of you, and then George Bell, the boss. Did you ever sit around the office in those early days and say, what are we going to do with this?
No, I mean, we took our jobs seriously. Young guys that we were, young lawyers that we were following the money. We were following the case. We were building a case. If it ended with Dale Anderson, it ended with Dale Anderson. If it went on to other public officials in higher office, we were going to pursue that, and did.
In that time period, in 1973, did anybody in the public, other than you folks up close and the lawyers, know about Spiro Agnew being involved in taking money?
Not until...
Was it in the press at all?
Early August of 1973, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal broke the story.
That's right.
And I can't think of his name.
Jerry
right.
Landauer.
Yes,
That's right.
absolutely.
Yeah, that's right.
And where he got it, it didn't get it from us. I'm guessing he got it from witnesses of ours who... there were reporters all over our investigation at that point, but nobody was getting any information about Agnew until Jerry Landauer came up with it.
What did you all want to do next then in that process?
Move even faster, because we knew that, okay, this is the press scrutiny now was going to become intense, and it was going to make our investigation much more difficult, because we were going to be constantly distracted by all kinds of accusations against us and all kinds of attention. But we had most of the evidence in hand at that point. I suppose the only thing we still didn't have was our IRS net worth investigation, in which we would prove, we had witnesses who said they paid Agnew. What the IRS investigation would show was that Agnew spent substantial sums in $100 bills. That is, we show the money going in. The net worth investigation would show it coming out.
Let me go back to just make this point. How many times do you think over a period of a number of years that Spiro Agnew, Vice President of the United States, prior to that Governor of Maryland, prior to that the executive in Baltimore County, took cash money in hand?
Multiple times. He and others like him, including Marvin Mandel, whom we also wound up prosecuting.
Governor of Maryland.
Governor of Maryland didn't create this system. They inherited it. It was there, and that's the way they functioned. I think Agnew took bribes from his Baltimore County days all the way through to that episode that George Bell just spoke about, where he has an envelope stuffed with $10,000 in cash that he hands over to the Vice President of the United States, whose office at the time was in the White House.
As you all sat there in Baltimore, you had a grand jury. Where was the grand jury meeting?
It met in a room in the federal courthouse.
In Baltimore.
Yes.
And who went before that? Did you all?
And grand juries are organized by prosecutors. We would bring witnesses into the grand jury room and have them take the oath and testify in front of the grand jury, and we would be the ones asking them questions. We would be the ones deciding what witnesses to bring in and how to present the evidence.
How many times did you bring somebody in front of the grand jury that related to Vice President Agnew?
Oh, multiple times.
And who were the others besides Lester Matz?
Well, there was a bagman named Bud Hammerman, who at the time was a very successful, wealthy businessman, who was Agnew's principal bagman. There was a guy named Green, I can't remember. Alan Green, a second bagman. And there were others who had paid. And
Jerry Wolf,
another consulting engineer.
Well, he was also chairman of the State Roads Commission, in which capacity he acted as Agnew's bagman, keeping 50% of the bribes on state roads contracts for himself and passing on 50% of the bribes to Agnew.
Part of the reason to talk about this is what's obviously going on in Washington right now, grand juries and lawyers and people testifying against people in office and all that. Going back to that time period, did it ever leak out the kind of people that were coming in front of your grand jury?
Well, the press was Richard Cohen, I remember in particular, but other members of the press.
Washington Post.
Yes, Washington Post were very good and very clever at figuring out who our witnesses must be, and then getting them to talk to the press. They're very clever about how they do that. It's not dishonest or devious or anything, but they get witnesses to say much more than the witnesses are even realize they're saying.
I know at some point I think we had reporters assigned to each of us. There was a New York Times reporter whose name was Salpukis, Aegeus Salpukis, I think was his name, who my wife and I lived not more than 3 blocks from the federal courthouse in downtown Baltimore. And I would get to my apartment and phone would ring, and it would be this New York Times reporter that would say, "You're home now." So there was a lot of press scrutiny, and also the concerns that we had, as Tim articulated a few moments ago, actually occurred. They took after us. You know, Agnew's lawyers went after us as a group and individually, and they were alleging that we were leaking information to the press, which was untrue. So it was a time span that was really very tight. It was a matter of months from beginning to end, but it was intense.
We found this video. It's a man named Martin London, who was a Democrat then, but was approached to represent Vice President Agnew. This is an interview from 2017, not that long ago, with a man named Jim Zurin at CUNY TV up in New York. Let's watch this.
Partner Jay Topkis called me up and he said, "Marty, I've just had a fascinating telephone call." I said, "What's that?" He says, "Well, some guy called me up and he said, Mr. Topkis, can you come to Washington to meet a new client we'd like you to represent? And he's a very important person." And Topkis says, "Oh, is he a congressman?" And the guy says, "Higher." I said, "I can't mention his name." He says, "A senator?" He says, "Higher." He says, "Oh my God, a cabinet member?" He says, "Higher." He said, "Oh my God, you mean the president?" And the guy says, "Not quite so high." So I said to Jay said, "Marty, is there any reason we shouldn't represent the Vice President of the United States, who is facing a bribery charge?" And I said, "Are we going to get paid for this?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Then there's no reason we shouldn't represent."
Do you know that man, Tim Baker?
No.
Did you know any of Vice President Agnew's lawyers?
Not at the time.
And how many did he have around him when it got close to the copying the plea?
I had dealings with him later on, a couple of years later on, in completely different matters when I was in private practice, but I didn't know them at all during the Agnew matter.
As you were going through this, did you keep notes about this experience?
I didn't keep a diary. I did make notes. Lord knows where they are, probably in my attic somewhere. I think, you know, were we aware of the significance of what was going on? Sure. But at the same time, you know, we were working day and night. There wasn't that much time, speaking for myself, to sort of sit back and reflect on this. It was very intense. And, you know, I must say this, we did a great job. We nailed that guy. We put an airtight case together. And that took a lot of work. Us, the IRS agents who worked for us, and of course George Bell, who supervised us.
Here's some more of George Bell in that speech in 2003.
His response was, this is awful, but I was the United States Attorney for Massachusetts many years ago. And he said, I had a similar situation involving highway contractors and pavers in Massachusetts. And he said, this was the late 1950s. He said he asked for permission of the incoming administration to stay on as United States Attorney to pursue that investigation. And his permission was denied by the Kennedy administration, and he had to leave his job. And the incoming United States Attorney didn't pursue that particular investigation. So the United States the Attorney General, Mr. Richardson's response right away was, this is something that is deplorable, regrettable, intolerable as far as government is concerned, and you do what you have to do. You will talk personally to me, and I will be personally in charge of this.
Should have said he's talking about Elliot Richardson, was from Massachusetts, was the Attorney General there, came down.
U.S. Attorney.
Yeah, but he was also Attorney General of Massachusetts. But he came down here and he was the Secretary of Defense, he was the head of HEW, he ends up at the Justice Department. And did you guys ever meet him?
Oh, yes, we spent hours with him.
Would you like to tell the story of the Audi and the four of you all coming down back from Baltimore to Washington, and the first time that George Bell ever felt he could go to Elliot Richardson?
U.S. attorneys are very independent, unusually so in the federal system. But if you're going to investigate somebody, a major federal official in Washington, you need to report to the department. And in this case, we knew we had to tell the Attorney General. And we kept making appointments to come over and tell him. We were afraid of leaks, so we wouldn't tell his secretary what it was about. And the appointments kept being canceled at the last moment. And finally, on July 3rd, I think we were supposed to go over there, and we had an appointment. We got a call saying the appointment was canceled, and we just went anyway. We just showed up, and we sat in the waiting room until finally Richardson agreed to see us. And that's when we first told him about the case we had against Agnew. And at that point, the case was already really strong. We had a number of witnesses.
Did he know anything at that time?
No, and you referenced the Audi. That was George Bell's car, and the four of us on that particular occasion, but others as well, because we went to the Justice Department to meet with Elliot Richardson and his staff frequently. We kept game planning how we're going to handle this, because the Attorney General is in the middle of Watergate. He has no idea that the Vice President is now going to be also a part of a potential prosecution. And we were also, quite frankly, concerned that we would make our presentation and the Attorney General would say to us, great, thanks so much. He'd pat us on the head. These young guys from Baltimore said, leave your files and have a good trip home. And so we are in the U.S. the Attorney General's conference room. Tim was the guy who was going to make the presentation after introductions. And Tim starts making this presentation of our case, and periodically his secretary comes into, or assistant to Elliot Richardson's chair, whispers something, and he gets up and he goes and disappears for a while. And then he would come back and we'd begin again. We didn't know till later that actually it was the president, President Nixon, who was on some of those calls, and I think Alexander Haig on some of the others, complaining about something. And here we're trying to get to this point where we're going to lay this big fat egg on the Attorney General's desk. And Tim is making this presentation in his usual complete, effective way. And finally, we get to the point where we tell the Attorney General that this is all about the Vice President. And that's the part where, on this clip you showed, George Bell and the rest of us were waiting to see what the Attorney General was going to say. I remember I was sitting at my seat at the table across from a bust of Oliver Wendell Holmes staring at me. And I remember thinking, you know, pinch myself. Here I am. What's going to happen? And that's when the Attorney General said, you know, I was a U.S. attorney in Massachusetts. How do you guys want to handle this case? And made it very clear to us that this was going to remain our case, and he and his staff was going to be involved as well.
What's your memory?
When we were worried, we were always worried, not that Elliot Richardson would shut down our investigation. Well, we had a very high opinion of him. We knew he had experience as a prosecutor himself. What we were worried about was he would look at us and say, "You guys are too young for this. This has got to be taken over by prosecutors in the Department of Justice who are much more experienced than you." So we wanted to make the best possible presentation, give the best possible impression of ourselves. We actually thought we were pretty hot stuff. We thought we were good. Barney, in particular, had really substantial. He'd convicted a congressman. And also, we knew we had a hell of a case, and if we laid out what we had accomplished already, how much evidence we'd put together, we hoped he would let us remain the prosecutors on the case. And I don't think there was ever any question in Mr. Richardson's mind that he was going to take the case away from us. Sure, he was going to supervise us, but and we had any number of long sessions with him in which we went over details. And particularly when the plea bargaining began, he kept us apprised of every step. He had us over to Washington for long meetings in which we debated back and forth what kind of plea ought to be accepted, and he always heard us out on the merits. He never once said, "Baker, you're a 31-year-old kid. I'm the Attorney General of the United States. Shut up." He always listened and responded on the merits, always.
It was an amazing experience for the three of us, the four of us, including George, of course. It was an extraordinary experience.
Did you feel at the time that you could indict the Vice President?
We believed that we could indict the Vice President. We believed that he was not immune from prosecution while in office. And in fact, his lawyers, among the defensive positions they took was that he couldn't be prosecuted, that he was cloaked with immunity. And they made that request to the Justice Department, and the Solicitor General at the time, Robert Bork, wrote an opinion summarizing it, as I will, saying, the President of the United States is immune from prosecution for crimes committed while in office, but the Vice President can be indicted while in office.
What was your reaction to that?
Well, I thought it was a very persuasive opinion, and in any event, we were absolutely determined to nail this guy. He was the extent of the corruption was really amazing. Of all the people we prosecuted in Maryland for corruption, and there were a lot of them, he was far and away the worst. And here he was right in the line of succession. One point we ought to make here is how fortunate we were and the country was that Elliot Richardson was the Attorney General deciding this. Supposing it had been John Mitchell, who himself was corrupt and went to prison for cover-up.
How soon after that did Elliot Richardson resign because he was asked to fire the special prosecutor?
2 weeks. The
10
Saturday
days.
night massacre was 2 weeks later, right?
10 days, maybe.
10 days, maybe. Within 2 weeks.
Saturday night massacre, yeah.
Go back to the way you were prosecuting among yourselves this case. What kind of leverage did you have at the time that you were going in for the plea bargain? In other words, how many different cases were there where you could pull somebody in to testify against the Vice President?
We had a complete, comprehensive case. We had nailed down every part of the case. We had witnesses. The witnesses their testimony was corroborated. We had these amazing IRS agents who had put together this third-party network case that Tim referred to earlier, where we traced the money going to the Vice President, these bribes and extortionate payments, and we followed the money to show, both with witnesses and with documents, that he got the money and what he did with the money. It was a complete case.
In the end, go ahead.
We had a number of witnesses. I would say at least a dozen witnesses who nailed Agnew directly. And then we had all the backup documents, corroborating witnesses. This was a very strong case.
How much did President Richard Nixon know, and we were right in the middle of the Watergate hearings and all that at that time, about Agnew?
I do remember we were aware that the president, at least for a period of time, was unaware of our meetings with Elliot Richardson. And I remember a meeting we all attended, not in the conference room, but in Elliot Richardson's executive office, where the subject came up, Mr. Richardson, have you told the president yet? And he said, no, I haven't. What do you think we should do? And we talked about Richardson at the right time going over to the White House, meeting with the president and letting him know that his vice president was now the subject of serious criminal investigation.
Do you know what his reaction was?
The president's?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I do know that it was one of the wonderful things about Mr. Richardson was he did tell us about these things, but this was something on which I don't think he really asked our opinion. This was, to put it mildly, above our pay grade. But he did inform us about it. He kept us informed at every step.
Did you ever get one of his doodles?
Oh, you bet. I still have them framed.
Me too. I have mine too.
What was he doodling about? Well, I mean, he was known for this. But what kind of doodles did he do when you were talking to him?
Well, when we first talked to him, the very first time, he was very impatient with us because we were first of all laying out our credentials, because to us the most important thing was to make sure that he had confidence in us. So he doodled then, but as soon as I started laying out the evidence, the doodling stopped and he started taking notes.
I do remember one argument we were having about the vice president's fate, and Richardson would often doodle in circles, but this one he was doing straight lines, very rigid lines. And when the meeting was over, I turned to one of Elliot Richardson's two senior administrative officials, a guy named J.T. Smith, and I said, could I have that? And J.T. said, well, I don't know. And he took it and he put it in an envelope. And the next meeting, Richardson gave it to me with a nice note to Ron Liebman, etc., saying very nice things about me. And it was that doodle. And I still have it. It's faded a bit because, unfortunately, Elliot Richardson used magic markers and nothing more delible, but I still have it.
He would sometimes he'd get, I guess he didn't like his doodle, so he'd crumple it up and throw it in the wastebasket. As soon as the meeting was over, we all would dive for the wastebasket to retrieve these doodles.
Spiro Agnew died in 1996 on September the 17th, but 16 years earlier he gave this interview. You have to listen closely as to what the accusation is. This was done out in Los Angeles.
I didn't know what General Haig meant when he said anything may be in the offing. Things may get nasty and dirty. All I knew was that he tried on 5 separate occasions in 2 months to force my resignation.
I think then that there were men around Richard Nixon, either in the White House staff or in the official mechanism of the CIA, who were capable of killing a vice president of the United States if they felt he was an embarrassment.
I don't doubt that at all.
Do you think he really felt any threat of being killed by the CIA?
What he felt was a threat of going to prison. He was terrified of going to prison. That's what drove that was his whole impetus for accepting some kind of a deal with us.
In the end, how much money did he actually take?
I don't think I remember.
I don't
There was
know.
a lawsuit brought by John Banzaf and his students for $265,000 that he ended up paying back.
That would be about right.
Yeah, it was a substantial sum. This is in the 1970s and the 60s, I guess. That sounds about right, but I don't.
But why wasn't he asked? I mean, in the end, tell us the end event that you all were in the courtroom when it happened.
Well, we knew why we were going into court. A plea bargain had been arrived at. The judge who was handling the case had blessed it, but the day the case was scheduled for this plea, no one else knew. And in fact, the gallery was filled with reporters because they were there. There had been, Agnew's lawyers had subpoenaed reporters to try and get them under oath and to question them about who their sources were for these leaked stories. So the gallery is filled with reporters and their lawyers who think that this is going to be litigated, whether or not these depositions could go forward. Of course, we knew, we had our wives, we called our wives to get down here right away. The courtroom, the judge got on the bench, court was brought into session, and the judge said to this group, the courtroom's going to be locked for this proceeding. So if any of you have to leave, leave now. And then in came the vice president, and he went to the defendant's table and sat there or stood there with his lawyers. Just before that, he had resigned his office because there was this issue of, you know, if he resigned as vice president, would that raise issues involving immunity? So there was this minuet that we had created where he resigned, came into court, pled, and that was that.
We had been up all night the night before writing what turned out to be a 40-page summary of all the a detailed summary of all the evidence against Agnew, which was presented in court the next day and filed as a part of the court proceeding. And although Agnew pled to nolo contendere to filing a false tax return, the falsity of the tax return was that he didn't report all of the kickbacks and bribes that he had taken as detailed in that 40-page statement. And the next day, that 40-page statement was reprinted in its entirety, word for word, in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the Baltimore Sun, and God knows how many other newspapers around the country.
As you know, though, there are a lot of people wanting him to go to prison.
Including including people sitting right here.
Well, tell us that background story. And
well, that was, you know, that was the gravamen of this whole thing. Agnew didn't want to go to jail, and he had this get-out-of-jail-free card. What was that? This is Watergate. Richard Nixon was a walking dead man, politically speaking. It was only a matter of time, most everybody understood, before he would be forced out of office. That would make Spiro Agnew, this vice president who we have under investigation, president. Can you imagine how the country would react? President Nixon, a crook, leaves office. Vice President Agnew, a crook, becomes president. So he had this this get-out-of-jail-free card. And Tim, Barney, and I, for the longest time, felt very strongly that Spiro Agnew should be treated like any other American citizen who committed a crime like this. And we had very heated discussions with Elliot Richardson, with the Deputy Attorney General, Don Ruckelshaus, with the head of the criminal... William Ruckelshaus, with the head of the criminal division,
Henry Peterson.
And we didn't have the I guess the maturity to see what Elliot Richardson realized early on and convinced us of through this long series of debates and arguments, and that is that it was more important for the country for Agnew to be out of the line of succession than whether or not he went to jail.
what did George Bell want, your boss?
George, he let us do most of the arguing. I don't remember George taking a strong position. He certainly didn't disagree with us, but he let the three of us carry the argument that Agnew ought to go to jail. Barney kept making the argument that he didn't want the American people to see that somebody in high office walked away, that the same rules would apply to a very important public official that applied to ordinary people. I agreed with that. I know Ron did. I also just thought this is a really bad guy and he belongs in prison, and it grated that he wasn't going to go there. But Richardson was so impressive. I believe that very first time we met with him, when we told him what we had, I think from even then that he realized that the most important thing was to get this guy out of the line of succession. That was sort of the first thought. I can't remember his words, but he articulated something about how important that was, and he never wavered, and never should have.
Given the nature of what we have in Washington, D.C. right now, the discussion going on around the president, this remark from George Bell back in 2003 has some reason to watch.
The months of August and September, well, as far as the public was concerned, was a kind of a kabuki dance of the president expressing support of his vice president, and the vice president going on television and making speeches about his innocence and attacking the prosecutors. And finally, in Los Angeles, the vice president publicly attacked the Department of Justice. And I'm told that it was at that point that President Nixon, through emissaries, said, out. You can't be doing this to our government. You can't be publicly maligning the Department of Justice. You're going to have to come up with an exit strategy.
What is your reaction to that, given what you know about today's activities?
Well,
I think what do you think of Richard Nixon suggesting that you can't attack the Justice Department if you're a vice president?
Well, the president did a pretty good job of attacking a lot of people. I really don't have a reaction to that, to be honest.
I don't either. I mean, Nixon, he had not done anything. In a lot of ways, it probably would have served his purposes for Agnew to stay in office, because then people would have been more reluctant to get rid of Nixon if Agnew was going to step into the presidency. Well,
he did support him for a while, and then he didn't, and then he stopped, and he cut him loose.
So after that day and the court was over, what happened to Spiro Agnew?
Well, I don't know firsthand, but he was very friendly with Frank Sinatra, and I think Frank Sinatra provided him with funds.
Said $200,000 loan right out of the box.
I read that as well. He then seemingly did some work with Middle Eastern business people. He wrote a book that was full of junk and crap and lies.
Including lies about his personal lawyer back in the Baltimore County days.
Now, this is his memoir, not his novel.
Right. His memoir. It was called Go Quietly or Else.
But in there, he accused his lawyer, George White, who was a very distinguished and very honest Baltimore County lawyer, accused his lawyer of helping him to cover up, and that is, he defamed George White. So George White sued him for defamation, asking for $1 in damages, but asking for a declaration that he'd actually been defamed. And Agnew finally had to admit that he had defamed George White, that he'd actually told George White that he was guilty of all these offenses, and George White got to tell the world that that's what Agnew had admitted to him.
Agnew was a careless man. Here he had this longtime lawyer who was prevented, because of attorney-client privilege, from disclosing publicly that Agnew had admitted to his lawyer that he in fact had engaged in this corrupt practice.
He went on, I think, to form a consultancy and sold his services internationally and made lots of money and lived in Rancho Mirage right outside of Palm Springs in California. In 1995, get your reaction to this. This happened over in the Capitol.
Now, I'm not blind or deaf to the fact that there are critics who feel that this is a ceremony that should not take place, that the Senate, by commissioning this bust, is giving me an honor I don't deserve. No doubt we'll be reading and hearing more criticism along that line in the days ahead, and it deserves, in my opinion, a response. So I would remind those critics that regardless of their personal view of me, this ceremony has less to do with Spiro Agnew than with the office I held, an honor conferred on me by the American people over 2 decades ago when they elected and re-elected me as Vice President of the United States.
Now, we've just been through a period where statues have been torn down, because of old history that people don't like. Every vice president gets a statue like this over in the United States Senate as being president of the United States Senate. Do you have any reaction to whether or not he should have had this honor?
If it's tradition, okay, but I agree with what Spiro Agnew just said. It's an honor he didn't deserve.
He besmirched the office. It's a disgrace that there's a statue to him.
Going back, looking at what tripped it again, what tripped the fact, again, he could have gotten away with this. What made the difference in the law that people who don't practice law, don't understand the grand jury system or all that, or the U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys?
Well, there are federal laws that make it a serious crime, felony, for a public official to corruptly take money, to accept bribes or to extort money. And when these politicians and public officials do this, they leave a trail. There are witnesses who are giving them money, witnesses who are generating the cash. Then the money goes to the public official. The public official uses the money. There are IRS regulations, and what happens so often is these guys don't get away with it because there are young prosecutors, federal prosecutors and state prosecutors whose job it is to find this, and if in fact there's a case, to bring it.
What's the value of immunity and how much of it was given in this case?
Well, we gave out a fair amount of immunity. Without promising witnesses something in return for their testimony, you're not going to get testimony. You're not going to have people who go to prison for the full length of the prison sentence they deserve and who are then going to give you the information. You've got to be able to offer them something in return. And then further to what Ron was saying, there are the laws in place, there are the investigative tools in place, and there are determined, hardworking prosecutors in place. And if they start, and all over the country, before 1973 and certainly afterwards, there have been public corruption investigations that have unearthed and prosecuted and convicted corrupt public officials. And that will continue.
How long were you an assistant U.S. attorney?
I was 3 years assistant U.S. attorney, and then I came back as the United States attorney for almost 4 years.
And where did you go to college?
Williams.
Where did you get your law degree?
Harvard.
And who were you the clerk for?
I clerked for Harrison L. Winter on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, and then I clerked for Chief Justice Berger on the Supreme Court.
One memory from Chief Justice Berger's experience?
He was friendly, and he was a nice guy.
Ron Liebman, how long were you assistant U.S. attorney?
About 5 or 6 years.
And then what did you do?
I went into private practice with a law firm in Washington, a small boutique litigation firm. After about a year or so, I moved to a firm then called Patton Boggs and Blow. That became Patton Boggs and is now Squire Patton Boggs. It's a large corporate law firm with offices in Washington and other places in the United States and across the world.
Your greatest frustration when you think back to this experience at the time?
Do we have any? We were really lucky. We had Elliot Richardson, we had George Bell, we had Barney Skolnick, we had Ron, and we had Pete Tortowitz as maybe the best IRS agent ever. We had a bunch of revenue agents like Marvin Case and others. The whole team we were very lucky in that all these wonderful people were in the right places.
Yeah, chemistry was great, and we were young but serious. And the way that the case evolved and our involvement, Barney's and Tim's and mine and George Bell's with the Attorney General of the United States, the Deputy Attorney General, the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, in addition to the pride that I have, and I know Tim and the others do, in the job we did, in terms of my development as a lawyer, it was an incredible experience.
Who's the boss of George Bell at that time?
The Attorney General of the United States, Elliot Richardson.
What?
Well, through the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division. There's a hierarchy.
What direct line, I mean, thinking of today, what direct line does the President of the United States have to a U.S. attorney if they want to? Can they fire him?
Well, the U.S. attorneys are presidential appointees. So I suppose he could. He could directly, the way he would do it would be he'd direct the Attorney General to fire him, wouldn't he?
Didn't our present president fired the U.S.
attorney for the Southern District of New York?
He reached out and did it, and
Maybe
had the power to do it.
There was a funeral for Richard Nixon, looking for the date, back in April the 27th, 1994. Just want to show this video. This is the first time that Spiro Agnew had come in contact with the Richard Nixon family and all since he had left. And he had not, I don't know whether he talked to Richard Nixon or not, but here is Bob Dole giving a eulogy, and watch for Spiro Agnew.
Strong, brave, unafraid of controversy, unyielding in his convictions, living every day of his life to the hilt, the largest figure of our time, whose influence will be timeless. That was Richard Nixon. How American. May God bless Richard Nixon. And may God bless the United States.
So what would you two say to young people that are watching this about the practice of law, about our American system of justice?
In this case, it worked. In Watergate, it worked. I don't agree with Senator Dole about the place of Richard Nixon in history. I think the place he has in history is to show what a corrupt president was and what damage he could do to the country with his enemies list, with his cover-up, and that the system worked in getting rid of him.
I think the system not only worked, I feel very strongly that it still works, and it will work, and it will continue to work. We are a country of laws, and we are a country with a moral fiber and moral backbone. And I feel very strongly that despite a lot of events that are unfolding now, that the system will continue to work.
I forgot to ask you where you went to school.
I went to a small college at the time called Western Maryland College. It's now called McDaniel. And I went to the University of Maryland Law School.
I need to ask you both, after I know you went on and practiced law in your life, what are you doing today?
I'm writing novels.
Are you retired from law?
Yes.
I'm retired from law, too.
Do you miss it?
If I airbrush out the stress, the pain, the need to find clients, I miss it, but I really don't. I had a great run, and it was a wonderful opportunity for me, but it was time to end. It ended.
Reliving all of this, I sometimes think to myself that I peaked at 31.
Our guests have been Tim Baker, former Assistant U.S. Attorney, and Ron Liebman, same job in Baltimore, prosecuting Vice President of the United States, Spiro Agnew. Thank you very much for bringing us up to date on history.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.